Can you guess what tonight's show is about? I don't need to tell you, do I? The first half of the show, I'm going to be speaking to Bhaskar Sunkara from Jacobin to talk about, of course, Donald Trump winning again. In the second half of the show, I'll be speaking to Dalia Gebrial about what it means for the rest of us outside of the United States. Trump has won the United States presidential election, and he won big. Pretty much all of the states which were seen as competitive, he has either won or is set to win. So you can see there, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia have all gone to Trump. Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona are expected to go to Trump. So he's currently on 277 electoral college votes, and it is sure to go higher. Donald Trump has become only the second person in American history to win two non-consecutive presidential elections. So lots of people have won two, but normally they're consecutive. He had a gap in between them. Very unusual for this to happen. Trump also looks on track to win the popular vote. Now, the last time a Republican achieved that was 2 decades ago, George W. Bush in 2004. Of course, it's a little bit odd to be able to win a presidency and not win the popular vote. That's what happened in 2016. Of course, lots of people could then say Trump won, but it wasn't really fair. It's harder now because he's won both the Electoral College and the popular vote, or it looks like he'll win the popular vote. Trump, as you can imagine, was jubilant at his Palm Beach victory rally.
It is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy? I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
I think that we just witnessed the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States of America. And after the greatest political comeback in American history, we're going to lead the greatest economic comeback in American history under Donald Trump's leadership.
We're going to have to seal up those borders, and we're going to have to let people come into our country. We have to let them come back in, but they have to come in legally. A star is born, Elon. He's a character, he's a special guy, he's a super genius. We have to protect our geniuses. We don't have that many of them.
This is karma, ladies and gentlemen. He deserves this. They deserve it as a family. I want to thank the Nelk boys, Aiden Ross, Theo Vaughn, Bustin' with the Boys, and last but not least, the mighty and powerful Joe Rogan.
The last person you heard there was the CEO of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, giving a shout out to fighter and podcast host Joe Rogan, whose interview with Donald Trump had millions and millions of views before he went on to endorse the now president-elect, I suppose. You also heard there Donald Trump give a shout out to Elon Musk. This was the celebratory tweet from Musk, who said, "Let that sink in." You can see it's a Photoshop of Musk holding a sink in the Oval Office. The original image is from when he made the same joke at Twitter HQ after buying the platform. Then he actually took in the sink to their office headquarters. And Elon Musk has an immediate reason to be cheerful. According to Forbes, this morning, Tesla shares hit a new record, soaring by 12% and making Elon Musk $15 billion richer overnight. Now, that certainly makes the $130 million Musk donated to Trump's campaign seem like a smart personal investment, at least. And whether or not they funded Trump or Harris, America's billionaire class can now expect some serious tax cuts. And that's especially because, as well as the presidency, the Republicans look set to control both houses of Congress. The Republicans have flipped Senate seats in Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia, giving them at least 52 of the Senate's 100 seats. So with more seats to be counted, they already have a majority in the House of Representatives. It's too early to yet say who's won the majority, but given what a good night it's been for the Republicans, it would be surprising if they lost the houses or the House of Representatives, which they controlled. The Senate, they'll have won from the Democrats. It would be surprising if they lost the House of Representatives to the Democrats in what's been a very good election for them. So on such a disastrous night for the Democrats, what was Kamala Harris to say? Well, so far, not much. The crowd at her rally last night were told this.
We will continue overnight to fight to make sure that every vote is counted, that every voice has spoken. So you won't hear from the vice president tonight, but you will hear from her tomorrow. She will be back here tomorrow to address not only the HU family, not only to address her supporters, but to address the nation.
Now, Harris is set to address the nation this afternoon, so I don't think people are expecting that her not speaking last night means she's going to do a Donald Trump and contest the election results. I'm joined now by Bhaskar Sunkara, founding editor of Jacobin and president of The Nation magazine. Bhaskar, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure this must be a very busy day for you. Let's get straight into this. We've got a lot of sort of polling data to go through and comments, but I want your basic take. What happened?
My basic take is that inflation was the overriding concern, and that was compounded by just how poor of a communicator Joe Biden was. So by headline figures, the US did better than any other advanced capitalist country on earth in the last few years in terms of job creation and GDP growth. And I think there were some real successes in the Biden administration as far as the Infrastructure Act that was passed, some other national industrial policy measures, the resurrection of some manufacturing jobs at a time when other countries like Germany, for instance, were massively shedding those types of jobs. So there were some successes, but can't get around the fact that especially in the last 2 years of his presidency, Joe Biden has been unable to communicate, just full stop. His debate performance was incredibly just cringeworthy and I think hard to watch for even people who are really critical of Biden, especially on his foreign policy, especially as relates to Israel, Palestine. But it really was a unique thing to watch a leader that was unable to regularly and competently communicate with the American people. So I think we're in a general environment where inflation has hurt incumbents. I think we can look around the world to examples, even figures as strong as Modi in India lost some ground in an inflationary environment, but we can look elsewhere too to figures like AMLO in Mexico and the Morena Party that was able to actually build more support despite inflation. So I do think there is some political aspect to what's going on, but I think a lot of it boiled down to discontent with the economy and desire to punish Democrats for stewarding that economy.
So, I mean, there's two. I mean, I agree with you. It seems like it was fundamentally about the economy. We'll go through some of the exit polls in a moment. But I suppose there's two separate issues there, isn't there? There's the actual economy and how they communicated about the economy. And sort of one argument is that the economy was good, but Biden was a bad communicator, and then Harris sort of didn't have enough time to make that up. The other argument is that the economy wasn't good, and however good your communication was, there's no way around that. And so then it's a question about the fundamentals. People just really hate inflation.
Yeah, I think both could be true in the sense that, okay, the economy is good in relative terms compared to what it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago, even. It's good in relative terms compared to trends in other advanced capitalist countries. I would certainly rather be in the U.S. as a median worker in the U.S. than in the U.K. For instance. But a lot of the really important pocketbook issues that people have, like housing affordability, these are long-term structural problems that are rooted a lot in many cases scarcity and other long-lasting things that the Democratic administrations of the past weren't able to address. And I think Biden didn't lay out a credible message to saying, here's how I'm going to tackle these things. So even when there were policy solutions, like very belatedly, Democrats started even toting the idea of targeted price controls at certain moments for some grocery items. These were arguments that weren't made with convictions. People didn't take particularly seriously, and they couldn't make up the ground. So I think there was poor communication, and also there is lingering discontent and uncertainty about the economy. And I also think that it's worth saying that many people do feel like their real wages aren't catching up with the economy. And for certain people who, in the US, we have a lot of debtors, we have huge amounts of consumer debt through credit cards and other things. So I would note that among wealthier Americans, many of whom ended up voting for Harris, or let's say people earn between 100 grand and 300 grand a year, these people might have been able to save and might actually have been making more money in their savings account or on the stock market in this inflationary environment. But for other Americans who are barely making ends meet to begin with, and before used to hold money on a credit card with 9% interest, that credit card is now at 29% interest. They're feeling the pinch even more. They're feeling the pinch through auto loans or other things. So I think inflation definitely has affected different segments of the population in different ways.
Look in some more detail at some of these economy questions. So Jeff Stein is from the Washington Post economics reporter. He tweeted this. Roughly 67% of voters rated the economy as not so good or poor, according to the Washington Post exit polls. He sort of then editorializes a shockingly poor number amid a hot labor market, booming stocks, much lower inflation, and growing GDP. But widespread voter dissatisfaction with the economy has been clear for years. Lots of people pointed out in response to this tweet, which I think is correct, that lower inflation is probably what bureaucrats think about. It was 10%, now it's 2%. That's good. It means it's down. And I suppose if you're an economic policymaker, there's a reason why that's what they focus on. But for a voter, what you're looking at is how much do your groceries cost compared to 4 years ago, not how much do they cost compared to last year, right? Because if you say it's down to 2%, well, they're only 2% more than they were last year. But if it was 10% or 10% or 20% the year before that, then your groceries are much more expensive than when Donald Trump was in power. Now, even if the causality doesn't work, it's not because it's not Biden who caused that inflation. Voters are going to blame the incumbent, which is why incumbents have had such a difficult time everywhere. I thought the result made this piece published in the Financial Times the day before the election look especially prescient. It was by Rashir Sharma. He's a former senior investment banker at Morgan Stanley. It's not a sort of classic leftist. He argued the US economic boom, which so many people have been talking about, was in fact a mirage. In the piece, Sharma said that US growth was being driven by rising wealth and discretionary spending among the richest consumers and was distorted by growing profits for the biggest corporations. And he wrote this: although the world marvels at unsinkable US consumers, a growing number are priced out of homes and falling behind on credit card debt. The bottom 40% by income now account for 20% of all spending, while the richest 20% account for 40%. That is the widest gap on record, and it is likely to widen further, says Oxford Economics, a consultancy. Most Americans now spend so much on essentials, such as food, that they have little left for extras like travel or eating out. The point he's making there, sort of at an aggregate level, if you're an industrialist, you're saying, well, the Americans, they're buying stuff. The statistics look good. But what he's saying is that more than ever, a disproportionate number of the people who are making those purchases are the wealthy, and actually a huge proportion of the electorate are only able now to buy essentials. They don't get to do discretionary spending. Discretionary spending meaning that spending which you get to choose which to do. So when you buy pasta or toilet paper or pay your rent, that's not discretionary spending. When you upgrade your smartphone, that is. According to an exit poll from NBC, though, the economy wasn't actually the number one issue for voters. Sort of a warning, this is just one poll, but in this poll, voters were asked to choose one issue out of 5 that they cared most about. Now, focus on the numbers on the left here, because that's the proportion of people who told NBC this was their number one issue. So only 4% said foreign policy. That didn't swing this election. 14% said abortion, relatively significant. 31% said the economy, very significant. 11% immigration. But the most significant issue, according to this exit poll by NBC, was the state of democracy at 35%. You can see here also those blue and red lines. That shows you how people who prioritized these issues voted. Of the 31% who said the economy was their number one issue, 79% voted Trump. Of the 35% who said democracy, 81% voted Harris. Bhaskar, I don't know how seriously you take these sort of exit polls, but it does seem, well, I mean, it's clear, isn't it? The economy damaged Democrats, and people who were concerned about democracy were more likely to vote for Harris. Does that actually mean that Harris was right to bang on about democracy, and if she hadn't done it, would have been even worse because the economy was a losing story for the Democrats?
Well, I think that a lot of the exit polls have had that top two figures reversed, but they roughly show the same thing as the economy and democracy as the one and two issue in either order. Then a distant third and fourth issue would be immigration and abortion. I think that part of this is explained by simply issue salience of what the Democrats wanted to be salient in this election, what a lot of their surrogates have been talking about. Obviously, also the blatantly undemocratic behavior of Donald Trump, making the issue of democracy more salient, especially for upper income voters for whom the economy was already doing fairly well. I think the message of this election is largely the class de-alignment, the loss of workers from the Democratic Party base. And the Democratic Party base held up pretty well despite all those years of deindustrialization, all that struggle under the Carter years and the Reagan years in the late 70s and 80s. In 2008, you could say that a real working class coalition, a multiracial working class coalition, elected Barack Obama to office. But since 2008, that base has increasingly become disconnected from the Democratic Party. And we're seeing now that it's not just a white working class problem. It's not just a white male problem. It's a problem that's impacting Democrats with all sorts of demographics, with Latinos and others. And I guess the main question for me, for people who say that Harris shouldn't have focused on the economy, is what's the one uniting thing that connects all these different groups? What's the one uniting thing in most people's lives? It's your pocketbook. It's, will I have enough money to take care of myself and my family? I think this sort of common sense means that the economy you can't run away from the economy in an election. And I think we did polling with the Center of Working Class Politics and Jacobin, and that polling was pretty clear that the weakest message for Harris was a defend democracy message, and the strongest one were a more populist message that not only talked about the economy, but also named villains, talked about billionaires, talk about corporations price gouging, talk about anything really to really direct concerns that people have towards a new set of villains. Otherwise, the villains are going to be quote unquote elites in the Trump conception, which are professors and policymakers and all sorts of marginalized groups too. They're all kind of lumped in together as cultural elites. And I think Harris really needed to present a message that had a villain, that had economic elites, that had someone to blame.
So I know I've seen lots of people sort of on Twitter say they should have had a more populist message. To me, it seems like it probably wasn't really about messaging. It was about the reality of the past 4 years, right? So the reason they could talk about democracy is because that was something threatening in the future. And I don't think people thought that Joe Biden was going to end democracy. But the economy, I mean, you can sound as populist as you like. If people just go to the shop and they see that, their groceries are more expensive, however much you sort of rail against bosses, haven't you already lost, basically, if people are associating you with higher prices?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think that you could look at positive examples, like I used the example of AMLO in Mexico, of a government that governed during a inflationary period that was able to have regular and direct contact with its base through, a daily program, through regular press conferences, through grassroots organizing, through the Morena base, and it's been able to build on its successes and actually go about a transition of power from a incredibly popular, singular political figure to a new figure, a woman from a minority background, which is kind of the dream for a center left party to be able to build this sort of coalition. So I think it would have been more possible to win on the economy if Biden was able to talk to the American people and to say that some of this inflation, by the way, was a result of Biden, was a result of government action under both Trump and Biden. But heating up the economy has preserved jobs. It has done a lot of good things as far as growth. And I think telling that story while also saying that some of the prices are caused by price gouging and corporations, and here's how we're going after them, and having that regular dialogue with people, I think the Democrats would have been able to own that issue. And I think immigration, we shouldn't even discount it as an issue. So that's, and that NBC exit poll was around 10 to 15%, I believe. I think with immigration and with crime more generally, too, in the US, there is a sense among a lot of voters of disorder. It's not necessarily a reactionary impulse. It's not a Donald Trump style build the wall, close down everything, or a return to the most extreme and violent sort of carceral visions. But there is a sense that rules aren't being followed. And if we need immigration, we need controlled immigration. I think Harris was able to, in the end, speak to both of those, but I think Biden was unable to get ahead of those issues. And my fear is that unless the center left gets ahead of those issues and is able to communicate effectively on it, the country will just continue to lurch to the right. Because thankfully, as is, I think this is a strange thing to say the day after Americans just elected Donald Trump, but I think there's still generally more liberal sentiment in the U.S. on immigration than in many, if not all, European countries, for instance. But the trends aren't moving in the right direction there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. It's because, in terms of prices and what swung this election, Owen, who's in New York, Owen Jones, our friend, said, I'm going back to my hotel in New York with a Muslim Pakistani American cab driver who voted for Donald Trump because the prices were too high under Biden. So it does seem like we're getting quite a sort of common story on this. Let's look at some more data from that NBC exit poll. This shows how different voter groups voted. So in terms of gender, men were more likely to vote Republican. They split for Trump by 54 to 44%. The split among women was the precise opposite. So women voted Harris by 54% and Trump by 44%. That's a 20-point gender divide. If you believe these exit polls, that's actually smaller than it was in 2020. Although people sort of have been talking a lot more about gender this time, presumably because one of the candidates was a woman. In 2020, their exit poll showed there to be a 23-point difference between men and women. And when it comes to race, as you'd expect, Trump won among white people and lost among everyone else, apart from this other category. I'm not quite sure what fits into there. But according to this poll from the NBC group, it was among Latino voters where there was the biggest change. So in 2024, 45% of Latinos told the pollsters they voted for Trump, which is up from only 32% in NBC's 2020 exit poll. The education divide, as ever, still seems to be a big deal. Harris won 57% of university-educated voters, but only 44% of those without a college degree. That really matters because, as you can see on the left, most voters don't have a college degree. Bhaskar, what can we say about the Latinos? They're still voting Democrat disproportionately compared to the rest of the population, but a big jump in the number of Hispanic people voting for Trump. People are thinking this is the guy who had the racist rally in Madison Square Gardens where the comedian said that Puerto Rico was a floating island of trash. And this is the Donald Trump who back in 2016 called Mexicans or said that Mexicans across the border, they were sending rapists. How can it be that Latinos are, almost 50-50 split now between Harris and Trump?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is with this excessive demographic analysis that a lot of the Democratic Party has subscribed to, which I think has put people into very neat identitarian characteristics. So again, if people think Trump is going to be better for the economy and they're concerned about the economy, and that's the most important thing on their minds, and they're voting in an election, they're already citizens, so their place in the country is already secure. They might vote on that basis. There's all sorts of reasons why people might vote for candidates that are less than ideal and other things. I personally voted for Kamala Harris despite having deep anger at her position and Biden's position on the war in Gaza and Israel's actions. So I think in both minds, thinking that Harris and Biden were enabling something despicable, but also thinking on both that issues and other things, Trump would be a worse person to have in office and pulling that lever. It's very, very similar to a voter that might think Biden might have some, Trump might have some backward views. He might, not be great dinner company. He might despise certain people who look like me or certain people who immigrated in. But I think he's going to be better for my family, or better on a host of other issues, or better on some issues that I'm concerned about because I'm more socially conservative, or yada yada. I think this is pretty normal to imagine that people have contradictory views and vote on different bases, but it becomes abnormal when we think in terms of a group identity, or the fact that quote unquote POCs need to have solidarity with each other, or all these sorts of constructs that I think have led the Democratic Party down into a rabbit hole that thinks about different voting groups as these segmented markets need to be communicated with very particular and different beliefs, when I think one strong universal message would and could work in the future.
Months to talk about what Trump's second term is going to look like, because obviously he's not going to get inaugurated until January, isn't it? But give me your sense. What's the second Trump presidency going to look like?
So the good news is his first presidency was not that extreme. His first presidency was pretty similar to the presidencies you would see of any Republican. He deregulated, he cut taxes, he did all sorts of things that were a mistake for the economy, but it was within the spectrum of what a Mitt Romney Republican would do, with some emphasis on tariffs. He just picked poorly designed tariffs. I'm not against tariffs in the abstract. He just protected the wrong industries in the wrong ways. But I think that did help with a paradigm shift that allowed Biden to really pursue national industrial policy and protectionist measures that I think were effective and were better designed. So I think in practice, that was the Trump administration. Even when it comes to deportations, Trump deported around 250,000 people. Obama at his peak deported over 400,000 people. It's complicated about why that happened. There was a reduction in undocumented immigration to the U.S. during the period that Trump was in office. I think a lot boils down to state capacity. So I actually honestly, it's a lot easier to say it's going to be horrible, it's going to be dangerous, there's going to be mass deportations of millions and millions of people, because it's better to be prepared for the worst and organize against that outcome than to let your guard down. But the level of analysis, I don't think the U.S. has either the will or state capacity for a sweeping deportation regime beyond the amounts we saw at its peak under Obama. I just think, as usual, liberals will cover and be, concerned with this at a moral level, because someone's doing it in a brazen fashion like Trump, as opposed to someone who has the political skills of Obama doing it subtly. I think his economic program is a real worry this time around, though, because the particular tariffs he wants to pursue, many of them can be enacted through executive order. There is a provision that allows certain tariffs to be enacted by the executive branch instead of our legislative branch, if it's deemed as needed for national security. So a lot of the trade war with China might escalate. A lot of other measures might be undertaken that will, I think, put a damper on the U.S. economy. I don't think Trump will end up being blamed for a lot of this. And in that case, I think we'll just generally have an economy that is built on more scarcity. And in conditions of scarcity, I think that's conditions in which the far right is able to push zero-sum visions, where there's makers and takers. And of course, in their conception, the takers are always immigrants and are always marginalized groups. And I think you might have something similar to the post-Brexit environment in the UK, as far as there being a sense that the best days are behind the country, economically at least, and that being a boon for the far right. So in a certain way, I think, given the alternatives, I would much rather that Trump governs as a typical right-wing pro-business government than enact some of his tariff plans, which I think, again, I'm not against tariffs in the abstract or protecting, certain industries in certain moments, but I think they're poorly designed. It will put a pretty big economic damper, but there are limits to what he could do. There's limits how functional the U.S. state is. We're not like the UK. You can't win an election and actually govern. The Republicans are not going to have 60 Senate seats. I think it's still 50-50 on the House. I actually think there's a chance that even if the Republicans have a majority, it's a very, very slim majority of only literally 1 or 2 seats. I'm not sure that majority will hold. So with divided government, what Trump will be able to do is what he could do via executive order, which might not be a ton.
Bhaskar, Sunkara, thank you so much for joining me on Novara on what I'm sure is a very busy day for you over at Jacobin and The Nation. So thanks for speaking to us again.
Thanks for having me.
Donald Trump is the new president of the United States, and our leaders in Britain have been some of the first to bend the knee. Keir Starmer was quick out of the stocks with this statement. Congratulations, President-elect Trump, on your historic election victory. I look forward to working with you in the years ahead as the closest of allies. We stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of our shared values of freedom, democracy, and enterprise. I'm not sure they're Trump's values. From growth and security to innovation and tech, I know that the UK-US special relationship will continue to prosper on both sides of the Atlantic for years to come. Foreign Secretary David Lammy also offered his congratulations. Congratulations to real Donald Trump on your victory, he says. The UK has no greater friend than the United States, with a special relationship being cherished on both sides of the Atlantic for more than 80 years. We look forward to working with you and JD Vance in the years ahead. Lammy, though, might not have had the best of mornings after the internet quickly unearthed this old tweet from 2017. So back then, David Lammy was saying this. Read Daily Mail story. Yes, if Trump comes to the UK, I will be out protesting on the streets. He is a racist KKK and Nazi sympathizer. Now, lots of people have commented that this could damage relationships between the UK and the United States now that Trump is president. I'm not so sure. And the reason I say that is because JD Vance was quite famous for comparing Trump to Hitler and saying that he was a never Trumper. And then he changed his mind, and now he's vice president. So Donald Trump isn't necessarily someone who holds grudges, so long as you are willing to bend the knee. Kemi Badenoch, though, saw an opportunity. She's the new Tory leader, of course, at today's Prime Minister's Questions.
The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary met him in September. Did the Foreign Secretary take that opportunity to apologise for making derogatory and scatological references, including, and I quote, Trump is not only a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath, he is also a profound threat to the international order. And if he did not apologise, will the Prime Minister do so now on his behalf?
The Foreign Secretary and I did meet President-elect Trump just a few weeks ago for dinner for about a couple of hours, and we discussed a number of issues of global significance. It was a very constructive exercise.
Dalia, will David Lammy and Keir Starmer be worried?
I mean, of course not. I mean, what those statements demonstrate to me is that classic Starmerite, centrist, Lammyite kind of approach, which is vacuous, unprincipled nonsense, and a desire to maintain this sense of everything's going to continue as normal, status quo, no disruption, nothing, which to me is the exact reason that we are in this mess. The overall thing that I have learned from the responses, both from political elites in this country and also elite journalists in this country, is that no one has any intention of learning any lessons from the past 10 years, that we're going to continue to see this pandering, this conceding, this coddling of far-right figures, whilst offering absolutely no alternative vision to not only the far right, but the centrism that is leading to the emergence of the far right. I am seeing that there is absolutely no attempt to change tack on the conditions that has led us into this disaster. Because ultimately the dynamic that we routinely see play out, especially over the past 10 years, is that the right is shifting, is lurching towards the far right, particularly because, the status quo, liberalism, neoliberalism is dead. It is very clear that the existing order, this existing kind of combination, this ghoulish combination of allowing the market to cannibalize everything that is important to us, everything that makes life worth living, whether it's public space, whether it's industry, whether it's our water systems, our housing systems, allowing the market to run roughshod over these infrastructures of daily life, whilst offering these vague platitudes towards individual freedom and democracy and whatever. And any time that there's an attempt to suggest that actually this status quo is breaking down at the seams, that when we look at the ability of people of normal people, that for the majority of people, their basic needs are not being met by the status quo. They are not being met by this established economic political order. People are unable to meet their basic everyday economic needs. And no matter how much the inflation figures are comparatively better or worse, the fact of the matter is, if the rate of inflation is decreasing by a couple of percentage points, that doesn't change the fact that people's wages are absolutely out of step with the cost of living, and yet a tiny minority of people seem to be getting wealthier and wealthier off these crises. So that's the economic crisis, shows that the status quo is falling apart. We are also seeing the recurring disasters that are related to climate breakdown, that people have absolutely no resources to protect themselves against. We're seeing, a market-driven war machine that has showed us all over the past year that human life in this world has absolutely no value. And witnessing all of that, these liberal centrists have absolutely nothing to offer us other than to simply tell us that everything's going to be okay, that, we just keep going as we're going. We're going to fiddle with a couple of things here and there. This percentage point is coming down by, 1 or 2%. Everything's going to be fine. And if anyone tries to provide an alternative vision from the left, we are going to crush them mercilessly, because ultimately we are less afraid of fascism than we are of socialism. Because when you have these moments of liberal capitalism, the contradictions folding in on themselves, and liberal capitalism being unable to meet the needs and the dignity of everyday people, there is a coalition of people that are always going to use that to lurch to the far right, that are always going to lurch towards this fascist adjacent, whether or not it's fascism proper, but certainly a fascist adjacent vibe, let's say. And what the center left is doing, but what that doesn't mean that is the only alternative that exists. In fact, I think there is a much bigger coalition of people out there who want a vision of emerging out of that status quo that is actually about protecting human life, and actually about improving material decency and reducing inequality. But that coalition of people have absolutely no serious political vehicle through which to express themselves. Instead, what they have are these vapid centrist, so-called centrists who are in fact fanatical in their slavery to their own ambition and their smug entitlement to govern. And because of that, they will not allow any kind of alternative vision or sense that actually we can restructure this, our economy, and restructure our politics in order to meet the polycrisis that faces us, the crisis that people are feeling acutely in their everyday lives, regardless of what statistics or these various markers that we use to describe the economy tell us about the economy improving. Actually, on a really basic everyday level, people are not living the way that they think they should be living in some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And any time any kind of alternative that's not a Trumpist alternative, or is not, Kemi Badenoch or Boris Johnson, anytime an alternative tries to emerge from the left that is about saying, how can we get ourselves out of this crisis by restructuring our economy and our politics to not be exclusively about clearing the pathway for capitalism and the market to do whatever it wants to do, but is actually about redistributing resources to make sure that everyday people have what they need to be resilient in the face of those crises. The Starmers of the world, the Bidens of the world, the Kamala Harrises of the world, the Clintons of the world, make sure that that voice and that approach is strangled before it can even get a chance to be accessible to everyday people. And so what I am seeing, I think, when we have when we're looking at, for example, Clinton, when Donald Trump was running in 2016 and his slogan was "Make America Great Again," what did Hillary Clinton come up against that with? America's already great. This time, when Trump is coming with the same message of "Make America Great Again," which is ultimately just a way of signaling that the way that America is right now, the way that the economy is, the political system is structured, is rigged and skewed against everyday people, and that there is some kind of different future horizon that we can reach. Obviously, for the majority of people, that future horizon is absolutely apocalyptic. But in response to that kind of at least tokenistic recognition that the system is not working, Starmer, Kamala Harris, all of these kinds of centrists end up responding because they are strangling alternatives within the political tradition of leftism. They end up being in this default position of defending the status quo that everybody hates. And I know that you said earlier, Michael, that they say that it's inaccurate to say that the problem is that the centrists did not offer a vision that could bring people out. I actually think that that's exactly what happened, because what we are seeing is this attempt to try and convert, Republican or conservative voters doesn't work. No matter how much you try and concede that ground, all it does is make that argument and make that ground more convincing. What I think the central inability of liberalism, of centrism, that central failure of this ideology that is no longer working is that if you have to pick between socialism and the status quo, they will always cleave towards the status quo, even if that status quo is deeply unpopular. And we know this because the polling routinely shows that when it comes to an individual policy basis, progressive policies that are about restructuring an economy away from just rampant market superiority to actually redistribution, to actually making sure that the profits and the wealth that is generated by working people is distributed fairly and put into the things that people actually care about, and not put into a death machine that is killing Palestinians abroad and killing people abroad, but is actually invested into communities around the world. When that actually is tested on a policy by policy basis, it's overwhelmingly popular. There's just no political vehicle that is available to represent that as a cohesive ideology. And so people are not coming out to vote for the status quo. They might not be wanting to come out and vote for Trump, because for a lot of people, I think, it's very clear what Trump stands for. And I don't say this with an attempt to kind of coddle Trump voters, because I think, we've seen enough of Trump. We've seen him, splitting up parents and their children at the border. We've seen, him instating Supreme Court justices that revoked Roe v. Wade. We've seen this. We know enough. But that coalition of people who would never vote for Trump, but nonetheless cannot bring themselves to vote for a status quo that is making their lives worse, what else do you expect? And so what I'm seeing by that statement from David Lammy and Starmer is a repeating of the mistakes that we have been seeing over and over again in the past 10 years, which is that the center left or these radical centrists are refusing to recognize the writing on the wall and believe that their inherent right to govern. Because with Biden and Clinton, honestly, I feel like the primary selling point that Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton had for themselves is that they should be allowed to be president because they've just wanted to be president for a really long time. And they went to the right schools and they cut their teeth in the right kind of policy work. They climbed the right ranks, that they deserve to rule. It's only fair that they get to rule. Well, it doesn't surprise me that that is not a compelling vision for people who are looking at the astounding amount of wealth that is pouring into, for example, the Israeli occupation forces, that is pouring into, that is pouring out of industry in the US, that is circulating around the world, and seeing that they can't even get basic necessities, that they don't have a sense of security in their own lives. Of course, they're not going to come out and vote for a status quo that is destroying them. It's happened over and over again.
Is there not a bit of a danger here that whatever the result, sort of people will say, this confirms my prior ideological beliefs. So they say, oh, the Democrats have won. I'm more left-wing than the Democrats. That means the Democrats should have been more left-wing. And I mean, on the face of it, what you've seen is that a lot of Americans are very willing to vote for the right. And you can sort of say, oh, well, there's this huge pool of non-voters who are really left-wing, who share my politics, who would have come out if only Kamala Harris said stuff that was more like what I would say. But I mean, what would have had to have happened for you to have said something different in a way? I mean, because we said this was the second highest turnout in a presidential election in 100 years, right? This wasn't a low turnout election. You can also sort of say, well, these policies poll popular, these policies poll popular. There's a bit of a pick and choose there, isn't there? Because there's lots of, if the Democrats were just driven by polling, they would have also probably been tougher on immigration over the past 4 years because people are quite negative about immigration. They're very negative about police reform. So there are sort of lots of issues where I suppose I worry when I see people saying, oh, look, there's this result. Aha, this confirms everything I already thought.
Well, first, no, it is a higher turnout election, but obviously a lot of that did go to kind of third parties.
The third party was, did it? I mean, the third party support was really small at this election, wasn't it? The Greens got hardly anything.
But also what I would say is that turnout for the Democrats was incredibly low. And the reason that I say that this is evidence that we need, I'm not even going to say, let's say that it has to be exactly the kind of program that I would design. But what I would say is that if we are in this moment where, again, the status quo is making people's lives tangibly feel worse on a day-to-day basis, because people don't respond to statistics about inflation. That doesn't keep people warm at night. What keeps people warm at night, what keeps people's bellies full, is actually like the lived reality of their material existence. And if the choice is going to be, it doesn't even have to be my vision necessarily, but if the choice is going to be between a vision that in some cases seems to represent a departure and a vision that says everything's okay, we're on the right track, nothing's going to change, we're going to continue as we are, we've got all the celebrities next to us, we've got all of the people who are already doing really, really well out of this economy and really well in the society. If it's between those, that is the problem. So even if they had a vision that wasn't necessarily my vision, right, but was an alternative vision that could be convincing, that could be compelling, I think that would do better than this constant sense of like, of course, nothing can change. And if anyone comes out, whether it's Bernie Sanders, who obviously we've seen in many meaningful ways is actually not an insurgent candidate at all, but whether it's Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or whatever, if they attempt to create some kind of dissonance or alternative vision within that structure, we are going to denigrate and we're going to be so smug and be so patronizing and just through thoroughly anti-democratic means just crush them out of existence. In this moment of crisis, if you're defending the status quo, you are not going to win in a convincing way.
Let's look at some other international responses to Trump's election. Now, as you'd imagine, Hungary's right-wing Prime Minister and Trump ally Viktor Orban seems pleased. He said, the biggest comeback in US political history. Congratulations to President Donald Trump on his enormous win. A much-needed victory for the world. Other world leaders were a little more muted in their enthusiasm. During his last presidency, Trump initiated a tariff-based trade dispute with China, something he suggested he would do again. And US relations with China are perhaps the most strategically delicate part of the country's foreign policy. Following his win, China's foreign ministry spokesperson said this: we will continue to approach and handle China-US relations based on the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. Our policy towards the United States has been consistent. We respect the choice of the American people. A very professional sounding statement there, isn't it? In his last term as president, Donald Trump reinstated US sanctions against Iran. That was in 2018. An Iranian government spokesperson said this about Trump's victory: the US elections are not really our business. Our policies are steady and don't change based on individuals. We made the necessary predictions before, and there will not be change in people's livelihoods. I suppose they're frustrated because they're saying our policies won't change based on individuals. It was obviously Obama who signed the deal with Iran, the nuclear deal with Iran. Then Trump rips it up. Biden basically does nothing. And then Trump returns. That statement there, which, as I say, was somewhat reserved, it was somewhat at odds with the view of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who were expected to retaliate against Israel for a strike on the country late last month. A spokesperson for the Guard said they had not ruled out a preemptive US-Israel strike on the country, and he confirmed that they are ready for a confrontation. I'm sure they won't be looking for a confrontation with the United States because that wouldn't go very well. One country that may have watched the election results in the United States even more closely and with even more trepidation than Iran is Ukraine. During the election, Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. And now that he's president, Russia seems pretty pleased. So former Russian president and senior security advisor Sergei Medvedev said this: Trump has one quality that is useful to us. As a businessman to the core, he mortally dislikes spending money on various hangers-on and freeloaders, on idiotic allies, and on stupid charity projects and on gluttonous international organizations. Toxic Bandera Ukraine is in the same row, or in the same row. The question is how much Trump will be forced to give for the war. He is stubborn, but the system is stronger. In any case, today the green scum in Kyiv will burn themselves in white powder up to their ears. A really horrible statement there. Whether or not you think a peace deal would be, some sort of settlement would be good. Toxic Bandera Ukraine. I mean, these are terrible people. For his part, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded to the news like this: congratulations to Trump on his impressive election victory. I recall our great meeting with Trump back in September when we discussed the details of the Ukraine-US strategic partnership, the victory plan, and ways to put an end to Russian aggression against Ukraine. I appreciate Trump's commitment to the peace through strength approach in global affairs. This is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace in Ukraine closer. I am hopeful that we will put it into action together. We look forward to a strong era of a strong United States of President Trump's, or under his decisive leadership. The war on Gaza was an issue that divided progressives intensely during the presidential election. On the one hand, many advocated trying to punish Harris and the Democrats for her and Biden's complicity with genocide. People in that camp usually suggested people vote for the Green Party's Jill Stein. But there were others who said this strategy was completely self-defeating. America has a two-party system, they'd say, and a vote for anyone other than Harris is a vote for Donald Trump. So it's really, really heated, often quite terse disputes on the progressive side of American politics. Now, in the end, the size of Trump's victory means it's hard to argue the debate made much of a difference to any of the results. In Michigan, that was the swing state with the largest Arab population in America. There were some districts where Harris was punished and the Greens did reasonably well, but statewide, Jill Stein got only 0.8%, which was half of the margin by which Harris lost to Trump. So even if all of those people who'd voted for Jill Stein had instead voted for Harris, she still would have lost. But Palestine not being a decisive issue in this election does not mean the election won't be decisive for Palestine. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was certainly pleased by the news of Trump's victory, posting this: Prime Minister Netanyahu, dear Donald and Melania Trump, congratulations on history's greatest comeback. Your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. This is a huge victory in true friendship. Yours, Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu. It's clear why Netanyahu has reason to be pleased. The Middle East is unfinished business for Trump. Under his first administration, the Palestinians found themselves perhaps the most isolated they'd been in decades. And in 2020, Trump unveiled his self-named peace plan at a joint White House press conference with Netanyahu. Now, this was a disaster, shifting the conflict firmly in Israel's favor by recognizing Jerusalem as the country's capital and declaring West Bank settlements legal. The Trump plan was, naturally enough, rejected by the Palestinians and led to widespread protests in Gaza and the West Bank. But later that year, Trump also oversaw the signing of the Abraham Accords. These were agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. They were mediated by the US. And these were part of the process of normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states. The agreement saw the two countries recognize Israel's sovereignty and enabled them to establish diplomatic relations. Now, these normalization deals are highly sought after by Israel, and vociferously opposed by Palestinians. Indeed, many see the Hamas attacks of 2023 as a last-ditch attempt to stop Saudi Arabia signing their version of the Abraham Accords with Israel. And what of the war on Gaza that followed October the 7th? Well, it's clear Biden and Harris were no friends to the Palestinians, but where Trump showed any opposition to them, it was only because he wanted even more undying loyalty to Israel. This was Trump at the first presidential debate, where his opponent was still Joe Biden.
As far as Israel and Hamas, Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one that wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
Trump has also been clear he wants to see Israel be even more aggressive in the wider region, saying this about attacks on Iran.
They asked him, "What do you think about Iran? Would you hit Iran?" And he goes, "As long as they don't hit the nuclear stuff." That's the thing you want to hit, right? I said, I think he's got that one wrong. Isn't that what you're supposed to hit?
And there are signs that Trump plans to pick up where he left off. In a call with Netanyahu just 10 days before the election, Trump promised his full support for Israel's wars in Gaza and Lebanon, telling the Prime Minister to, quote, do what you have to do. Dalia, your thoughts on this? America has been had an absolutely appalling role in the Middle East this past year. And I mean, we can go way back before that, can't we? But Donald Trump probably will be even worse.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Gaza, I do think that there is no difference actually between a Harris and a Trump presidency. It just cannot get any worse from a Gaza perspective. From a regional perspective, certainly the risk is much higher with Trump, purely because when it comes to sparking a regional war, the Democrats were not so gung-ho on things spilling out into a regional war, but they also weren't really willing to do anything to stop it happening. So they were more kind of passive participants in that. And if it came to it, they would, of course, fully support Israel in a regional war. Whereas Trump seems to be much more gung-ho when it comes to a regional war, and he's more likely to be surrounded by advisors who are going to be pushing him in that direction. We saw from his previous presidency, he is willing to go even further when it comes to erasing Palestinians off the political map. And we know that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has been a lot less present in this election campaign, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, have been less present in this campaign, but he was in the previous Trump presidency kind of the main person who was being deployed to, hilariously in a way, main person deployed to advocate for Trump's position, to represent Trump's position in the Middle East. And we know that during this genocide, Jared Kushner's contribution has been talking about the real estate possibilities in an ethnically cleansed Gaza. So it is clear, and I think that I've seen some commentators saying that having this fantastical idea that somehow a Trump might be isolationist in his foreign policy, which could mean a retreat from the global stage. I think that's completely delusional. It is absolutely true that we are closer to a regional war now than we were before. And obviously that throws up the question of, and this will come through in the kind of polling afterwards, but to what extent did the complicity within the genocide in Gaza, to what extent did that shape the outcome of this election? I think most people who care about Palestine, who care about this genocide, and for whom that would have been at the forefront of their minds, know that for the region especially, things probably will be worse under a Trump presidency. And yet, can I understand why, after seeing reams and reams of footage of children's bodies shredded and hanging from buildings and people being blown up in their homes, can I understand why people simply couldn't give their vote to that? Of course I understand it. Of course, I can understand why so many people felt like they couldn't vote for that. And it wouldn't have even taken that much, I think, for Harris to at least just indicate that there was a possibility of a slight departure from total complicity and enabling that marked the Biden presidency. And yet the fact that she doubled down on that and treated people protesting on behalf of Palestine with contempt and this kind of shaming tactic, this disparaging tactic, which is just so, again, so characteristic of centrism, of left centrism now, that couldn't have helped her. And so we really are in a very, very dire situation where American people, many of whom will have increased in their solidarity for the Palestinian cause over the past year. Again, they had absolutely no outlet, absolutely no candidate serious candidate that could even represent a mild departure from that status quo. And so is it worse? 100% it's worse. But unfortunately, the lack of alternative, the lack of any serious alternative meant that we are in this situation where, once again, because we live in a world that is governed by US empire, unfortunately, this election has not only been disastrous for Americans, but it has been disastrous for the whole world. And so, yeah, I mean, it's devastating. From a Gaza perspective, nothing much is going to change, I don't think, because it cannot get worse than it already is. But in terms of the broader region, we are looking at some very, very risky years ahead of us.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that analysis. I mean, it's sort of on those long-term questions about sort of annexation and then also relations with Iran, where Donald Trump is quite different to, I think, a Harris administration would have been. But it's not going to make much difference if you're on the ground in Gaza, because if you're suffering a genocide, it can't get much worse, right? I think Donald Trump will openly support it in a way. I think he whereas sort of like the Democrats sort of say we're trying to tell him to respect human rights. I don't think Trump will bother with any of that. He'll say let them get the job done, right? And presumably that. Yeah, I imagine actually that could have a material effect, but it's marginal because it's already so close to as bad as it can be.
And what I would say is I can also understand, and I've seen some sense of, and I mean, I come from an Arab family. I'm in touch with a lot of Arabs both in the US and here. There is a sense that we wanted to punish the Democrats. We wanted to show it, because no other way that we've been trying to show you that we care about this issue, that Arab lives are important, that they're not just disposable, that Palestinian lives are important. Every other mechanism we've tried to show to exercise that voice has been strangled. And so it felt like the only opportunity to say there is going to be a price to pay for that. And I wish that I could join in that sense of schadenfreude, but unfortunately, the Democrats are going to learn nothing from this. In fact, what they're going to do is they're going to turn around and they're going to blame Arab and Muslim voters for voting against their own interests. Well, you didn't represent their interests to begin with. So who could they vote for in order to represent their interests? So we're going to see a lot of that blaming. We're going to see a lot of that scapegoating. And once again, a refusal to question whether or not actually was I the right person for the job? Is this ongoing commitment to preserving the status quo a winning strategy? They're never going to ask that question. They're never going to learn that lesson. They're just going to find a way to blame Arabs and Muslims who had no other way to exercise the fact that they care about this issue and this issue is important. They had no other way to exercise it. And so they exercised it, unfortunately, in some cases here. The consequences are not going to be any better, but many felt like they were left with no other choice.
Well, I mean, as I said, I think the size of Trump's win means that we will be spared some of those arguments. I mean, I think if Michigan had been a dead heat and the Electoral College was closer, then everyone would have been talking about the few thousand votes that Jill Stein got and saying this was the fault of Muslims or Arabs who couldn't be sensible enough to vote for the Democrats. But I think because it wasn't close, we will hear less of that. Let's go to some updates from the Middle East, from Israel. There were some political changes in Israel this week as well. And it does appear that whatever its outcome, Netanyahu appeared emboldened by the United States elections, or at least saw them as an excuse to put out some news that the Americans might not be so pleased about. Hours before voting began, he fired his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, citing a lack of trust and a cracked relationship between the two men. In earlier statements, Netanyahu had also accused Gallant of being insufficiently committed to Israel's war goals. While Americans were voting, mass protests at Gallant's sacking broke out across Israel, with protesters in Tel Aviv calling for an end to the Netanyahu regime. In Gallant's place, Netanyahu has now appointed his hardline ally, Israel Katz. Again, it's one of those situations where it's very difficult to sort of say, oh no, Gallant has been sacked. No, Gallant was the guy who was saying, let's have a complete siege on Gaza, don't let any food or water in. But the reason Netanyahu has sacked him is because he wants someone even more extreme in post. I mean, it's very similar to the American situation. There is very little, ways in which one could say that the Democrats did a decent job when it came to Gaza. But Netanyahu is celebrating Trump because he's even worse. Right? So this is a very depressing situation. Prediction in politics is a dangerous game. If you get it right, you can claim to be a sage. If you get it wrong, you get egg on your face. And someone who took that risk before the American presidential election was former Tory leadership candidate Rory Stewart. To his credit, he didn't hedge his bets, right? He was very explicit, somewhat brave, you could say. He tweeted this in response to a clip where Andrew Neil was saying how close it was. He said, journalists would like the US race to seem as close as possible. It suits their appetite for suspense and Andrew Neil's desire to prod the establishment. But this won't be a close race decided by a couple of thousand votes. He is wrong and Kamala will win. So he's saying Kamala's going to win and it's not going to be close. And he gives his explanation because Biden's government has been solid. Trump's lost ground since 2016. The young black male vote, which Trump needs, didn't turn out in 16, 18, 20, or 22. Young women like Kamala plus vote. The polls are herding at 50-50 to protect themselves after past misses ignore. The one thing he might have got right was the claim to ignore the polls, but he obviously got it in the wrong direction. As you already know, in fact, Trump not only won the Electoral College, but won the popular vote, and the Republicans have won the Senate. So Rory Stewart couldn't really have been any more wrong. And after the results came in, Stewart explained why he'd got it so wrong.
I got it totally wrong. I thought Kamala Harris would win, and I believed she would win comfortably. I thought it would be over quite quickly. Despite the polls showing 50-50. Why? Well, I can repeat my arguments. They were technical arguments about young African-American voters and how they would turn out, her ground game, the money, the performance of Biden's administration. It's all turned out to be wrong, completely wrong. I don't think, though, that I was fundamentally wrong because I'm patronizing towards people. I never felt that. I never felt that as a politician in Britain. I didn't feel I was patronizing towards my Brexit voting constituents. I think I was wrong because I'm an optimist. And I hate the idea of being right pessimistically. I think you can be a false prophet and right. You can align yourself with the worst instincts of humanity. You can assume that everything's going to hell in a handcastle, or you can hope. And my bet on Kamala Harris was a bet on the American people. It was a bet on liberal democracy. It was a bet against populism, and it was a bet on hope.
So are we wrong to think that that can work? That's the really difficult thing that this sort of confronts us with.
Well, it's so difficult because, of course, I felt in a very minor way, in Britain, seeing Boris Johnson take over, this just proves everything that I feared, that the bad people win, populism triumphs. And I've spent a long time trying to pull myself together and see moments of light and inspiration. You've just written a book inspiring young people to get involved in politics. We have to believe that the Middle East peace process can still be solved, the two-state solution is possible, that peace can come back to the world, and that the world can get back onto a better trajectory. But tonight is a very, very devastating body blow. This is 25% of the global economy. This is the world's largest, oldest, most mature democracy that has just voted for a multiple convicted felon.
As I say, I don't want to diss the guy too badly because he did come out and make a strong prediction. I sat on the fence. When Aaron pushed me last night, actually, I did say I thought Trump was going to win, but I didn't tweet that because I didn't want to get owned afterwards. So credit for, I suppose, putting his neck out there. But Dalia, he was very wrong, wasn't he? And what did you make of his explanation for how he got it wrong? Do you think it makes sense that he was just too hopeful?
I mean, I have no problem with people making predictions and those predictions turning out to be wrong, right? It's not, doesn't disqualify you from being a political analyst. But the question is, what does qualify you for being a political analyst? What does qualify you for being a political pundit in this moment, for being someone who comments on politics? Because what struck me there is his reasons for why he made the prediction that he gave had nothing to do with politics. It had nothing to do with this question, with a structural view of the state of politics and economics in this moment. It had nothing to do with looking at how have things panned out over the past 10 years. What is the overall direction that this world is going in? I mean, how many times, and this doesn't just go for Rory Stewart, it goes for the entire political chattering class. How many times you have to be proved spectacularly wrong? How many times you have to show yourself to be completely deficient of a political analysis that can structurally hold the moment that we're in before someone stands up and says, maybe you're not qualified to be narrativizing this particular historical moment. If someone else in their job screwed up this spectacularly this many times, I'm not just talking about Rory Stewart, I'm talking about the broader pundit class in this country. How many times could you do that without someone firing you? I mean, how do we fire these guys? Because clearly, if their job is meant to be political analysis and political insight, they have failed on multiple occasions because the data that they look at, the lens that they look at, is through these these general feelings of how they think the world should be, or their general sense of whether or not people are good or bad, or these kinds of micro trends that they're observing in the month leading up to the election. When he listed out why he thinks Kamala Harris is going to win, it was all things that he had identified as if he just tuned in 3 weeks ago into this thing called American politics or this thing called global politics. Whereas when you have a political framework and a long structural view of the world, and you look at things like patterns, and you look at this question of, if people, again, are in this sense of living in a moment of overlapping crisis, and one party is saying, everything's fine, I'm laughing, I'm swinging my hair around, I'm having a great time, I've got all the celebrities with me, and the other party is giving you a vacuous sense or a vague sense, but nonetheless a strong sense of departure from that norm, then maybe there's a chance that, given that this has routinely happened, whether it's Brexit, Boris Johnson, the first election of Donald Trump, this keeps happening. How could you still use the same framework and the same data and the same approach to look at the world when your approach is clearly failing?
We could talk about this all evening, but we've run over time already. So Dalia, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.